The digital sphere of Washington, D.C. crackled with an electric unease. Rumors, initially faint as whispers in the corridors of power, had surged into a full-blown storm. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the firebrand congresswoman who had become both a beacon of progressive ideals and a lightning rod for conservative ire, was on the precipice of indictment. News outlets, from mainstream networks to partisan blogs, buzzed with speculation. Snippets of heated debates from cable news pundits, echoing the deep divisions within the nation, filled the airwaves. Then came the leak, a short, grainy audio clip circulating like wildfire across social media platforms. A voice, vaguely resembling AOC's, seemed to offer guidance on how to navigate interactions with ICE agents. Phrases like, "remain silent," and "don't open the door without a warrant," barely discernible through the static. Authenticity was immediately contested, with accusations of manipulation and selective editing flying from both sides of the political spectrum. In the hushed confines of her Capitol Hill office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. AOC, her usual fiery energy subdued by a palpable anxiety, paced the room as she spoke with her trusted legal advisor, James Calloway. "This feels orchestrated," she said, her voice tight. "This audio, it's not the full context. They're twisting my words." Calloway, a seasoned lawyer with a calm demeanor that belied the gravity of the situation, nodded grimly. "We need to be prepared, Alexandria. There are forces at play here that go beyond simple policy disagreement." A tense phone call followed, with a veteran political strategist urging caution, warning of the potential for irreparable damage, regardless of the legal outcome. The fragile equilibrium shattered when Pam Bondi, flanked by a phalanx of determined-looking legal aides, stepped before a battery of microphones. Her announcement was delivered with the prosecutorial zeal that had defined her career. The United States government will not stand idly by while individuals actively obstruct the lawful enforcement of our immigration laws. Evidence has been gathered, and I assure the American people, justice will be served. She held up a sealed folder, her gaze locking with the camera's, a cryptic promise of revelations to come hanging heavy in the air. In the shadows, a figure hunched over a laptop, exchanging encrypted messages with a journalist known for his tenacity. "The paper trail, it leads deeper than they think," the message read, hinting at a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the courtroom. The chapter concluded with a late-night press release from Bondi's office, a formal announcement of a press conference scheduled for the following morning, where significant new information regarding the case against Representative Ocasio-Cortez would be unveiled. The nation held its breath, the political landscape bracing for the impending storm. The day of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's initial court appearance dawned with a palpable sense of drama. The courthouse steps were a chaotic tableau of fervent supporters chanting slogans of solidarity and equally impassioned detractors demanding accountability. The air crackled with the raw energy of a nation deeply divided. Inside, the sterile grandeur of the federal courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, every hushed conversation and rustle of paper amplifying the tension. The moment AOC and Pam Bondi stood face to face for the first time in this adversarial setting was charged with unspoken animosity. Bondi, radiating a confident resolve, offered a curt nod, while AOC met her gaze with a steely defiance that hinted at the battle to come. As the clerk began reading the indictment, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Beyond the expected charges of obstruction of justice, a more serious accusation was leveled: conspiracy to aid individuals in evading federal law enforcement, with specific mention of aggravated cases involving known felons with deportation orders. The added gravity of this charge sent shockwaves, suggesting a more deliberate and potentially criminal intent behind AOC's actions. A visible tremor ran through AOC's hand as she listened, her carefully constructed composure momentarily faltering. James Calloway, her attorney, rose to enter a plea of not guilty, his voice resonating with conviction. "These charges are politically motivated, Your Honor," he declared, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "They are a thinly veiled attempt to silence a dissenting voice and criminalize the act of informing individuals of their constitutional rights." A brief, pointed exchange followed between Calloway and Bondi. their words sharp as shards of glass, hinting at the legal and ideological clash that lay ahead. As the preliminary hearing concluded and the judge set the date for the full trial, the emotional toll on AOC was evident. Leaving the courtroom, navigating the throng of media and protesters, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd, a former campaign volunteer, now holding a sign of condemnation. The weight of this perceived betrayal seemed to hit her harder than the legal proceedings themselves. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text message: "Trust no one. They are closer than you think." A chill ran down her spine, the words echoing the unease that had been growing within her. The game, it seemed, had truly begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. Behind the scenes, away from the glaring lights of the courtroom and the cacophony of public opinion, AOC's inner circle launched their own quiet investigation. Led by a sharp-witted former campaign manager, Maria Rodriguez, the team meticulously began to dissect the backgrounds and affiliations of the potential witnesses lined up against AOC. Patterns soon emerged: subtle financial ties, previously undisclosed connections to conservative think tanks, and a surprising number of individuals who had grievances, both real and perceived, against the Congresswoman. Meanwhile, Callaway and his legal team focused on Karoline Leavitt, Bondi's media strategist. Their surveillance revealed a series of discreet meetings held in the hushed anonymity of upscale hotel lounges and secluded restaurants. Leavitt was seen in hushed conversations with individuals whose influence extended into the shadowy corners of political power, lobbyists with deep pockets, strategists known for their ruthless tactics, and even a retired judge with a controversial past. The content of these meetings remained elusive, but the sheer secrecy surrounding them raised alarm bells. AOC sought out Lena Hansen, an old friend from her activist days who had since become a respected investigative journalist known for her unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. Initially skeptical, Lena's interest was piqued by the inconsistencies and the overtly political nature of the case. After reviewing the initial evidence and hearing AOC's increasingly concerned accounts of feeling targeted, Lena agreed to discreetly look into the story. The team's efforts began to yield fruit. Maria uncovered a trail of consulting fees paid to Mark Harris, the former staffer, by a previously unknown shell corporation with links to a prominent Republican donor. Callaway received an anonymous tip, a heavily redacted document hinting at a coordinated effort to discredit AOC orchestrated by a powerful opposition group. As the chapter drew to a close, Maria managed to obtain a piece of security footage from a private club. The grainy video showed Karoline Leavitt engaged in an intense discussion with a man whose face was partially obscured but whose distinctive ring glinted in the dim light, a ring Callaway recognized as belonging to Arthur Sterling, a notoriously influential and fiercely conservative political operative known for his behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The implications were chilling. Forces far beyond Pam Bondi's office seemed to be pulling the strings. The grand jury trial commenced, the atmosphere in the packed courtroom thick with anticipation. Pam Bondi, with her characteristic sharp and methodical approach, called Special Agent Daniel Briggs as her first witness. He presented a seemingly straightforward narrative, detailing the ICE operation targeting a known felon and the subsequent discovery of AOC's Know Your Rights pamphlet being used to thwart their efforts. He spoke of the measurable increase in resistance encountered by ICE agents since the distribution of these materials, painting a picture of AOC's actions directly undermining law enforcement. Bondi's direct examination was calculated, each question designed to reinforce the image of AOC as someone who actively encouraged defiance of federal authority. However, when James Callaway rose for cross-examination, the tenor of the proceedings shifted. With calm precision, Callaway focused on the details Briggs had conveniently glossed over. He pressed the agent on the lack of a judicial warrant during the attempted entry, meticulously establishing the legal right of the individual to refuse access. The courtroom held its breath as Callaway asked, his voice steady, "Agent Briggs, in your 15 years of service, have you ever encountered a situation where simply informing someone of their constitutional rights was considered a criminal offense?" Briggs hesitated, a bead of sweat appearing on his brow. Not explicitly, he conceded. Calloway then subtly questioned Briggs's interpretation of resistance, highlighting that the individuals involved had not engaged in violence but had merely asserted their legal rights. A palpable tension filled the room. AOC watched intently, a flicker of hope igniting within her as Calloway chipped away at the prosecution's initial narrative. During a particularly pointed exchange about the definition of obstruction, a juror, a middle-aged woman with a thoughtful expression, audibly cleared her throat and leaned forward, prompting Calloway to reiterate a crucial point about the difference between informing and instructing. As Briggs stepped down from the witness stand, his initial confidence appeared somewhat diminished. Bondi shot him a tight-lipped look. Calloway exchanged a subtle glance with AOC, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. The first skirmish had ended, and while the prosecution had landed blows, the defense had managed to draw blood, sowing the first seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. The air in the courtroom crackled with a different kind of tension as Mark Harris took the stand. His presence, a former member of AOC's own team, carried the weight of potential betrayal. Pam Bondi, with a carefully crafted air of earnestness, guided Harris through his testimony. He spoke of his initial enthusiasm for AOC's work, followed by a growing unease as he perceived a shift from simply educating constituents about their rights to what felt like active strategies to evade ICE. His voice wavered slightly as he recounted meetings where specific tactics to avoid detection were allegedly discussed. Though he admitted under direct questioning that AOC herself never explicitly instructed anyone to break the law. The tension peaked during James Calloway's cross-examination. His approach was less confrontational, more a gentle probing of Harris' memories and motivations. He reminded Harris of their shared commitment to social justice, of the initial idealism that had drawn them both to AOC's cause. Then, the questions turned sharper. Calloway introduced the email exchange, the one where a younger, more idealistic Harris had lauded AOC's unwavering commitment to her principles. The stark contrast between the Harris of that email and the nervous witness on the stand was palpable. Calloway then delved into Harris' abrupt departure from AOC's office and his subsequent employment by a conservative policy group. Bondi's immediate objection was overruled by Judge Whitaker, who recognized the relevance of potential bias. The courtroom held its breath as Harris, his face paling, admitted that the job offer had come shortly after his resignation. The implication hung heavy in the air. Had Harris been incentivized to testify against his former boss? As Harris stepped down, visibly shaken, a seed of doubt had been firmly planted in the jury's minds. AOC, who had maintained a stoic facade throughout his testimony, allowed a flicker of sadness to cross her features. The sting of perceived disloyalty seemed to cut deep. Outside the courtroom, the reporter who had confronted Harris earlier managed to snap a photo of Harris being ushered into a waiting car by a woman closely resembling Karoline Leavitt. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly beginning to fit together, revealing a picture far more complex and potentially sinister than a simple case of obstruction of justice. Karoline Leavitt's entrance into the witness stand was met with a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Unlike the law enforcement officials who had preceded her, Leavitt exuded the polished confidence of a seasoned media strategist. Pam Bondi's direct examination was designed to showcase Leavitt's expertise in political messaging and to portray AOC as a master manipulator of public opinion. Leavitt spoke eloquently of AOC's immense influence, her ability to mobilize millions with a single tweet, and the chaos that often ensued, protests erupting, officers being doxxed, public trust in law enforcement eroding. She asserted that AOC's carefully crafted statements, while perhaps legally defensible, were a clear call to resist and obstruct. James Calloway's cross-examination was a masterclass in dissecting the art of persuasion. He began by establishing Leavitt's own reliance on carefully chosen words and strategically crafted narratives in her media appearances. "Ms. Leavitt," he asked, his voice laced with a hint of irony, "when you go on national television and label my client a criminal mastermind, would you consider that a carefully crafted statement designed to shape public perception?" Leavitt, initially composed, offered a tight smile, It's an opinion based on the available evidence. Calloway pressed further, introducing evidence of Leavitt's significant financial gains from her consistently anti-AOC commentary, highlighting the inherent bias in her professional incentives. He then skillfully turned the focus to the very nature of public discourse and the danger of conflating opinion with legal fact. "Ms. Leavitt," he stated, his gaze sweeping across the jury, "isn't it true that in a free society, even controversial opinions are protected? And that the role of this court is to determine guilt based on evidence and law, not on the shifting tides of public sentiment?" Leavitt's composure began to crack, her initial confidence replaced by a defensive posture. As she left the stand, the battle for public opinion, so central to this case, felt far from settled. Calloway had successfully challenged the narrative being constructed by the prosecution, reminding the jury of the crucial distinction between perception and proof. Behind the closed doors of their makeshift war room, AOC's team worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of information they had gathered. Lena Hansen's journalistic instincts had kicked into high gear, and her deep network of sources began to yield significant leads. The anonymous tip about a coordinated effort proved to be more than just a rumor. Lena unearthed documents linking the shell corporation that had paid Mark Harris to a powerful conservative lobbying group with a long history of targeting progressive politicians. Calloway, armed with this new information, decided to call a surprise witness, Franklin Monroe, a former senior advisor to a prominent Republican senator, a man known for his pragmatism and occasional bouts of conscience. Monroe's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. He revealed a clandestine meeting that had taken place months prior, involving key figures from the lobbying group, Arthur Sterling, and, surprisingly, Pam Bondi. Monroe testified that the discussion had centered around finding a way to politically neutralize AOC, viewing her as a significant threat to their agenda. The idea of leveraging her immigration advocacy to pursue legal charges was explicitly discussed. Bondi's face registered a carefully controlled fury as Monroe spoke, vehemently objecting to the relevance of his testimony. However, Judge Whitaker, his interest clearly piqued by these revelations, allowed the questioning to continue. Calloway then presented financial records showing substantial donations from the lobbying group to Bondi's past campaigns. The implication was clear. A politically motivated vendetta might be masquerading as a pursuit of justice. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. AOC watched with a mixture of vindication and a chilling realization of the forces aligned against her. The narrative was shifting once again, the focus moving from her actions to the potential malfeasance of her accusers. As Monroe stepped down, he made brief eye contact with AOC. A look that seemed to convey a mixture of regret and a quiet hope that the truth would prevail. The prosecution's strategy shifted back to the ground level with the testimonies of officers Reynolds and Williams. Bondi's questioning focused on the tangible impact of AOC's materials on their daily work, emphasizing the increased resistance and the missed opportunities to apprehend individuals with deportation orders. Their accounts were laced with a sense of frustration and the feeling that their authority was being undermined. However, Calloway's cross-examination took a different tack. He acknowledged the challenges faced by law enforcement but probed deeper into the specifics of each incident. He questioned the officers about the precise language used in AOC's materials, carefully distinguishing between informing people of their rights and explicitly instructing them to break the law or engage in violence. The emotional crux of the chapter came during Calloway's questioning of Officer Reynolds. Calloway presented body cam footage from the incident at the apartment complex. While the video clearly showed people citing AOC's materials, it also depicted them remaining nonviolent and simply refusing entry without a judicial warrant. Calloway asked Reynolds directly, "Officer, do you believe that individuals peacefully asserting their legal rights, based on publicly available information, constitutes a criminal act?" Reynolds hesitated, his initial certainty wavering. "It made our job harder," he admitted, "but, no, not necessarily criminal." Later, in a tense exchange with Agent Williams, Calloway introduced internal ICE memos that revealed growing concerns within the agency about the legality and ethical implications of some of the administrative orders being used for deportations. The memos suggested a potential overreach of authority, subtly undermining the prosecution's portrayal of AOC as the sole instigator of resistance to lawful enforcement. As Williams left the stand, his expression was troubled, hinting at a growing discomfort with the narrative being presented by the prosecution. A sense of unease began to permeate Bondi's demeanor. The unwavering confidence she had displayed earlier seemed to be subtly eroding. The courtroom held its breath as Calloway announced his final witness, Agent Marcus Thorne, a decorated ICE officer who had been conspicuously absent from the prosecution's list. Thorne's testimony was a bombshell. With calm authority, he detailed a series of internal discussions and directives within ICE that had occurred prior to the increased resistance attributed to AOC's materials. He presented emails and recorded conversations revealing that high-ranking officials within the agency had been pushing for a more aggressive enforcement strategy, even in the absence of judicial warrants, and that this had led to growing dissent among field agents concerned about violating constitutional rights. Thorne further testified that he had witnessed first-hand instances where information about impending ICE raids, including the one involving the felon mentioned in Agent Briggs's testimony, had been leaked to certain community groups, not by AOC, but by individuals within ICE sympathetic to the plight of undocumented immigrants. He revealed a clandestine operation, codenamed Stone Garden, initiated by a faction within ICE with the explicit goal of discrediting AOC by portraying her advocacy as a direct cause of obstruction. Pam Bondi's attempts to discredit Thorne were met with his unwavering testimony and the corroborating evidence he presented. Calloway then introduced a series of text messages between Karoline Leavitt and a number Thorne identified as belonging to a high-ranking official within the Department of Homeland Security, suggesting a coordinated effort to manipulate information and influence witness testimonies. The courtroom was stunned into silence. AOC watched, tears welling in her eyes, as the intricate web of deceit began to unravel. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex and disturbing than the prosecution had presented. As Thorne concluded his testimony, Judge Whitaker, his face a mask of stern disapproval, addressed Pam Bondi directly, his voice heavy with implication. "Counselor, these are serious allegations. The court will require an immediate explanation." The tables had turned dramatically. The final day of the trial was charged with an almost unbearable tension. Judge Whitaker's opening remarks made it clear that the revelations of the previous day had significantly impacted the court's perception of the case. He questioned Bondi's conduct and the integrity of the prosecution's evidence. In his closing arguments, James Calloway delivered a powerful and impassioned plea to the jury. He recounted the evidence that had been presented, not just of AOC's actions, but of the potential conspiracy to undermine her. He spoke of the importance of protecting constitutional rights and the danger of allowing political motivations to corrupt the pursuit of justice. "This case," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "is not just about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It is about the very principles upon which this nation was founded." Pam Bondi's closing argument was a shadow of her former confidence. She reiterated the prosecution's initial claims but struggled to reconcile them with the evidence of potential misconduct within her own ranks. Her attempts to paint AOC as a threat to the rule of law rang hollow in the face of the revelations of orchestrated deception. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the courtroom was summoned back to order. The foreman, his face solemn, read the verdict. On the charge of obstruction of justice, not guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to aid individuals in evading federal law enforcement, not guilty. A wave of emotion washed over AOC. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced Calloway. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Outside, the crowd of supporters roared with elation. Pam Bondi remained stoic, her face betraying nothing, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. In the aftermath, the story did not simply end with the verdict. Investigations were launched into the allegations of misconduct within ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. Karoline Leavitt faced public scrutiny and a potential loss of credibility. Arthur Sterling retreated further into the shadows. AOC, though legally exonerated, faced the arduous task of rebuilding trust and navigating the deeply fractured political landscape. The trial had exposed not only the vulnerabilities of the immigration system but also the insidious ways in which political agendas could intertwine with the justice system. The question that lingered was whether true justice had been served, and what the long-term consequences of this high-stakes battle would be for the nation's conscience.